rancher followed his dog to a cave behind the waterfall. What was hidden there changed his life. 3 days. 3 long, perplexing days since Blaze, my old German shepherd, had chased a wounded deer toe. On the 2nd day, I found the scratches. Thin, angry lines scored across Blaze's thick. By this morning, as the first rays of the sun painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, Blaze rose with a deliberate, almost ceremonial air. He didn't glance at me for permission, didn't offer a playful nudge. He simply started walking towards the well-worn trail that led to the ridge, his gait purposeful, decisive, like an animal who had made an unshakable commitment. In that moment, watching him, a profound realization hit me. I faced a choice stark and unavoidable. I could let my faithful companion disappear, lost to whatever potent obsession had taken hold of his instincts, or I could follow him step into the unknown and confront a mystery that I sensed with a deep tremor might prove some discoveries are powerful enough to fundamentally alter everything I believed about my own life. I sat my chipped ceramic coffee cup down on the porch, railing the clink, echoing too loudly in the morning quiet. My gaze dropped to Blaze's paws still caked with that telltale mud. For 3 days, my German shepherd had been bringing home soil that simply didn't belong anywhere on my property. It was darker, richer, clinging to his fur with a mineral tang that spoke of places where water carved hidden channels deep within the earth. Places Blaze had never once shown an interest in before last week. He continued to pace, a restless energy vibrating through him, pausing every few steps to cast that same intense, unblinking stare towards the distant waterfall. Those fresh scratches along his flanks, those thin, telltale lines, now made chilling sense. He'd been squeezing through tight spaces, and yesterday I'd even found stray pine needles embedded in his thick fur. But not from any species of pine that grew near our usual riding paths. Something had profoundly shifted 3 days ago when he'd chased that wounded deer towards the ridge. He'd returned, changed, preoccupied, as if that pursuit had inadvertently revealed something that now demanded his entire being. He'd barely touched his food since then, spending hours sitting motionless, focused on something only his keen senses could perceive. I crouched beside him, my hand instinctively going to his head, running my fingers through his thick fur. Beneath my touch, his powerful muscles trembled, a spring wound too tight, barely containing an explosive energy. For 15 years, Blaze had been more than a dog. He'd been my compass, my protector, my confidant in the quiet solitude of ranch life. He'd guided me through blizzards, helped track countless lost cattle across treacherous terrain, warned of approaching storms hours before the sky even darkened, even alerted me to unseen rattlesnakes before they could strike. His instincts had never, not once, proven wrong, but this behavior felt different. More urgent, yes, but also more personal, more deeply rooted in something that spoke to the very core of his being. Blaze suddenly rose, his movements fluid and decisive. He walked to the corral, stopping beside Daisy, my trusty bay mare. Then he turned, looking back at me with an expression that needed no translation. He wanted to go somewhere, and with an unyielding certainty, he wanted me to follow. "You found something out there, didn't you, boy?" I murmured, my voice a little rough with emotion. Blaze's tail wagged once, sharp and decisive, a punctuation mark to my question. He then moved towards the trail that snaked towards the ridge, pausing to look back, his eyes brimming with expectation. I studied the distant waterfall, the very sight of which had become the focal point of my dog's unwavering obsession. I'd ridden past it countless times over the decades, watered Daisy in the cool pool below during sweltering summer cattle drives. It was just another familiar landmark in a territory I knew as intimately as my own heartbeat. But Blaze, my intuitive, perceptive Blaze, had discovered something there that I, in my ingrained familiarity, had completely missed. Something powerful enough to command 3 days of his restless, determined attention. He started walking up the trail again, a subtle invitation to join him, not waiting for my permission or encouragement. His gait was purposeful, deliberate, following a route he had obviously traveled recently. The muddy paws, the fresh scratches, the stray pine needles. It all clicked into place now. Blaze had been making reconnaissance trips, learning the way, mapping every twist and turn, preparing himself for this very moment, when he would lead his master to whatever extraordinary discovery awaited. I watched my faithful companion disappear around the first bend, heading towards the ridge, with an unwavering determination that both thrilled and unnerved me. Blaze had never abandoned me before, never once chosen his own path over my guidance. The profound fact that he was doing so now meant whatever lay ahead was important enough to risk everything. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows across the valley. My cattle grazed peacefully in the lower pastures, utterly unaware that their quiet, predictable routine was about to be shattered by secrets hidden in places where falling water masked the sound of revelation. Blaze reappeared on the trail above, waiting with a patient intensity that was almost unsettling. He had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. Follow him towards whatever mystery the wounded deer had led him to 3 days ago, or spend the rest of my life consumed by the gnawing regret of wondering what profound truths lay hidden behind that distant thundering waterfall. The decision felt heavier than it should, as if crossing that invisible line would change more than just my morning routine. Daisy sensed my uncertainty as I approached her, my hands usually so steady, fumbling slightly with the saddle. Blaze waited by the gate, no longer agitated but focused like an animal who had meticulously completed his planning and was now poised for flawless execution. His quiet confidence unnerved me more than his earlier restlessness ever had. Blaze knew exactly where we were going. We followed the main ranch trail for the first mile, passing familiar landmarks. The old dead oak, the fallen log where we sometimes rested, the boundary markers of my daily routine. But when we reached the fork where the path traditionally split towards the summer pastures, Blaze veered sharply left without a moment's hesitation, taking the less traveled route towards the ridge. He moved with the assurance of recent familiarity, his paws finding the easiest footing over the rocky terrain. I started to recognize the subtle signs of his previous passages. Now that I knew what to look for: disturbed pine needles where he'd squeezed between close-growing trees, faint scratch marks on a fallen log where he'd scrambled over an obstacle, fresh paw prints in patches of soft earth, already 3 days old but still clearly visible. The trail climbed steadily, winding its way through scattered stands of fragrant pine and whispering aspen. Their leaves seemed to rustle warnings today, more ominous than during our previous carefree rides. Blaze maintained a steady, unhurried pace, occasionally glancing back to ensure I was still following but never deviating from his chosen route. He had clearly learned this path through multiple solitary journeys, meticulously mapping every obstacle and shortcut. As we ascended, the distant murmur of falling water began to grow stronger, evolving from a faint whisper to a palpable roar. I'd heard it before, of course, during quiet moments back at the ranch, but always as a distant, almost subconscious background noise. Today, however, it called to me with the same insistent urgency that had driven Blaze to make these secretive, solitary trips. That wounded deer had indeed led my dog to something significant, something powerful enough to risk my displeasure, something that now demanded our collective attention. Daisy picked her way carefully over loose stones and gnarled roots, her ears swiveling, constantly alert to every rustle and snap. Even she sensed that this journey differed profoundly from our usual predictable rides. Blaze's unusual behavior had infected us all with a palpable anticipation, an edge that bordered on anxiety. The trail narrowed considerably as we approached the ridge, forcing me to duck beneath low-hanging branches that bore fresh, undeniable scratches from Blaze's repeated passages. He had pushed through these obstacles again and again, driven by an unyielding determination to reach whatever destination fueled his obsession. The silent evidence of his persistence lay everywhere once I finally learned how to truly see it. We crested a final rise, and then with breathtaking suddenness, the waterfall revealed itself in its full, majestic glory. A 60-foot curtain of white water crashed into a deep emerald green pool surrounded by ancient moss-covered rocks. Mist rose in shifting ethereal veils, creating rainbow fragments that danced and shimmered in the strong afternoon light. It was beautiful, wild, and utterly captivating, and at first glance apparently empty of any secret worth Blaze's profound fixation. But my dog didn't pause to admire the spectacular scenery. He immediately led us down a treacherous, narrow slope towards the water's very edge, following a route that would have been impossible to navigate without prior intimate knowledge. Blaze had clearly scouted this precarious descent, tested the slippery footing, identified the safest path through terrain that could easily unseat both horse and rider with a single careless misstep. We reached a narrow, damp ledge beside the surging pool, and Blaze positioned himself with the precision of an animal who had stood in this exact spot countless times before. His gaze, however, was fixed not on the spectacular waterfall itself, but on something behind it, a darker shadow in the sheer rock face that didn't quite match the natural patterns of the wet, glistening stone. I squinted through the swirling mist, following my dog's unwavering stare, and there it was, barely visible behind the thundering cascade, a deeper darkness than it should be. An opening. A space where the relentless falling water had for decades concealed something profound from casual observation. Blaze whined once, a low sound of profound satisfaction rather than anxiety. He had completed the first phase of his mysterious plan. Now came the dangerous part. My dog stepped deliberately towards the water's edge, and in that moment a chilling understanding washed over me. Blaze's 3 days of meticulous preparation, his restless pacing, his silent, urgent pleas, they had all been leading with an almost cosmic inevitability to this precise moment. Whatever lay hidden behind that thundering curtain of water, my faithful companion fully intended for us to reach it together. The icy water stole my breath as I urged Daisy into the pool, then dismounted to follow Blaze. He swam with powerful, confident strokes, no longer the hesitant explorer of 3 days ago, but an experienced, self-assured guide who had tested this treacherous route multiple times. I struggled against the powerful current, my boots slipping precariously on stones, polished smooth by decades of relentless flow, while Blaze navigated towards the thundering cascade with practiced ease. The deafening sound of falling water filled the entire world, drowning out everything except the frantic rush of my own blood through my ears. The thick mist created a shifting, impenetrable curtain, making it impossible to see beyond my outstretched arm. But Blaze never wavered in his direction, his internal compass, his honed senses, guiding him with unerring accuracy. He had memorized this treacherous approach during his secret reconnaissance missions. Then, with a sudden unnerving grace, Blaze disappeared into the solid-looking wall of water. I followed, pushing through the crushing weight of the cascade, my arms raised instinctively to protect my face. The sheer force of the waterfall hammered my shoulders with enough power to knock me sideways, to disorient me completely. But I pressed forward, driven by the absolute certainty that my dog had proven this passage was possible. For a terrifying, endless moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except the roaring thunder that seemed to originate inside my own skull. Then just as suddenly I was through, gasping for air that tasted sharply of minerals and ancient stone. The cave opened before us, surprisingly larger than the narrow concealed entrance had suggested. A pale, diffused light filtered through the waterfall, creating shifting, ethereal patterns on the damp walls that stretched back into impenetrable shadows. Blaze shook himself vigorously, sending droplets flying, and immediately padded deeper into the cave's interior, his wet paws leaving fresh prints that overlaid countless older ones in the thick dust. My eyes adjusted slowly to the filtered greenish illumination. The cave extended far deeper than the entrance light revealed its secrets, swallowed by the gloom. But what immediately captured my attention wasn't the natural formation itself. Someone had been here before us, recently, judging by Blaze's confident navigation, but also decades ago based on what they'd left behind. Against the far wall sat a wooden crate, its pine boards weathered by time but still remarkably intact. Beside it, a leather saddlebag hung from a natural stone projection, carefully positioned to protect its contents from any lingering moisture that might penetrate the cave's depths. And scattered across a flat, smooth rock formation held down by carefully placed stones, lay a collection of papers that someone had arranged with deliberate, painstaking care. Blaze approached the cached items without a hint of surprise, his keen nose sniffing at objects he had obviously encountered during his previous solitary visits. My dog's calm, almost proprietary behavior confirmed what I was slowly, chillingly beginning to understand. Blaze hadn't discovered this hidden place by mere accident while chasing the wounded deer. The deer had simply provided the final necessary push that led him to investigate something he had been subliminally aware of for much, much longer. Dogs, with their extraordinary sense of smell, could detect the faint scent of old leather-aged wood, even the dried ink on ancient paper, from considerable distances. Blaze had probably been catching tantalizing traces of these scents for months, perhaps even years, carried on the subtle air currents that flowed from the cave's concealed mouth. The wounded deer had simply given him the excuse, the impetus to finally investigate what his extraordinary nose had been silently telling him existed here all along. I approached the papers with trembling hands, a mixture of awe and trepidation washing over me. They were old, undeniably, but remarkably preserved by the cave's consistent protection from the ravages of weather and moisture. The topmost document bore an official seal I didn't recognize, decorated with archaic symbols that suggested some form of past territorial authority. Legal language filled the page, written in a careful, elegant script, but certain phrases stood out with startling, almost violent clarity. Land rights, property grants, territorial boundaries, and then my own family name, Stone, written in that formal script near the bottom of the document. The paper slipped from my numb fingers as a profound understanding crashed over me like the very waterfall outside. These weren't just random forgotten documents hidden by chance. They were official records, legal papers that someone had deemed important enough to meticulously preserve, valuable enough to painstakingly conceal from hostile, avaricious eyes. Blaze watched me from his perch beside the wooden crate, his intelligent eyes holding a glint of satisfaction that bordered on pure smugness. The wounded deer, I now understood, had been an excuse, a catalyst, not the ultimate cause. Blaze had been planning this revelation, waiting with canine patience for the right opportune moment to lead his master to this hidden knowledge. Knowledge that would, I now knew with absolute certainty, change everything. I picked up the next document, my hand steadier now that the initial shock was giving way to a surging, almost feverish curiosity. This paper was different, more personal. A letter, its fading ink bearing the passage of decades, addressed to someone who shared my surname, Stone. The elegant handwriting belonged to an educated person, someone clearly familiar with both the precise language of legal documents and the profound, crushing weight of personal loss. As I began to read, the true immense magnitude of what these documents represented began to settle heavily and irrevocably in my mind. Everything I had ever believed about my place in this territory, about my family's humble history, about my very right to the modest ranch I had painstakingly carved from the unforgiving wilderness, had been built on foundations that were not, in fact, what they had seemed. And somehow my remarkable Blaze had known this discovery was waiting for us. The letter in my hands revealed a story that painstakingly rewrote 40 years of territorial history, a narrative meticulously addressed to my grandfather, Marcus Stone, a man whose name I now realized with a sickening lurch had been systematically and deliberately erased from all public records. The elegant, precise script detailed a chilling conspiracy of theft, a web of deceit that reached into the highest echelons of the territorial government itself. My family, I learned with a mounting sense of disbelief, hadn't been mere modest ranchers, struggling to eke out a living on marginal land. They had owned vast, sprawling holdings, prime grazing territory that stretched across 3 valleys, water rights that controlled the very economic lifeline of half the territory. All of it, every single acre, every precious drop of water, every invaluable mineral right, had been systematically stolen through forged documents and the insidious actions of corrupted officials. Blaze pressed himself against my leg, a warm, comforting presence, as I struggled to process this torrent of information that challenged, shattered, and utterly redefined everything I had ever believed about my heritage, my identity. My dog's profound patience suggested he understood the immense magnitude of what his master was discovering, as if he had been patiently waiting for years, perhaps even his entire life, for this precise moment of devastating revelation. Marcus Stone, according to the meticulously preserved lawyer's correspondence, had been a man of considerable wealth and immense influence, but a cabal of corrupt territorial officials had orchestrated his downfall with methodical, ruthless precision, utilizing false testimony and cunningly fabricated evidence to systematically strip the Stone family of their rightful property. This monstrous theft, I now understood, hadn't happened overnight. It had been meticulously planned, brutally executed, and painstakingly covered up by men whose very names I recognized from current territorial leadership, men who still held power and commanded respect. A detailed survey map folded neatly within the papers showed property boundaries that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the current official land divisions. According to these irrefutable legal documents, my modest ranch, the only home I had ever known, sat squarely in the very center of what should have been Stone territory. Thousands of acres of prime grazing land, invaluable water sources, and mineral rights that I now realized with a gasp would make their rightful owner one of the wealthiest men in not just 1 but 3 territories. The wooden crate, weathered and unassuming, yielded even more damning evidence of my family's stolen legacy. Faded photographs of grand buildings I didn't recognize, receipts for livestock purchases that numbered in the thousands, contracts for mineral extraction bearing my grandfather's undeniable signature. Each item, each piece of paper painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of a prosperity that had been deliberately and ruthlessly erased from all official memory. But it was the final document that made my chest tighten with a suffocating mixture of profound grief and incandescent rage. A leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandfather's precise, elegant handwriting, meticulously documenting the systematic, brutal destruction of everything Marcus Stone had painstakingly built. The entries grew progressively more desperate, more frantic as the conspiracy tightened its unforgiving noose around him. The final entry dated almost 40 years ago to the day revealed a man's growing visceral fear, not just for his stolen property but for his very family's survival. They had hidden the most damning evidence, he wrote, and then fled under the cover of impenetrable darkness, abandoning their rightful inheritance to preserve their very lives. A second, more poignant letter bore my own name, Jedediah, in my grandfather's careful looping script. A letter written to a grandson he would never meet, a legacy he could only hope would one day be reclaimed. The old man, I realized, had created this hidden cache as a desperate form of insurance, irrefutable proof that could reclaim what was rightfully theirs if someone with stone blood ever found the courage, the unwavering will to fight for it. The letter included specific instructions, names of people who might still be trusted, and a chilling warning that resonated with undiminished weight across 4 long decades. The men who had orchestrated the Stone family's destruction were still powerful, still dangerous, still utterly committed to protecting their ill-gotten gains. Anyone, my grandfather warned, who dared to challenge them would face the exact same ruthless, merciless opposition that had driven Marcus Stone into exile and oblivion. Blaze's low growl, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through the silent cavern, abruptly interrupted my reading, jolting me back to the present. My dog's entire attention was now focused on faint, almost imperceptible sounds that penetrated even the thundering roar of the waterfall outside. Hoofbeats, multiple riders, approaching the pool below with a singular purpose rather than casual exploration. My blood chilled in my veins as a horrifying realization hit me. Our presence, my discovery, hadn't gone unnoticed. Blaze's repeated secretive visits to this cave had inevitably left a trail that experienced trackers could easily follow. The disturbed ground, the fresh path through the undergrowth, the irrefutable evidence of regular passage between my ranch and the waterfall. It had all created a pattern visible and undeniable to anyone who knew how to read the silent language of the land. Someone I now understood with a gut-wrenching certainty had been watching. Someone who understood with chilling precision that Blaze's unusual behavior meant that a profound discovery was now imminent. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing ominously off the rocky walls surrounding the pool. Multiple horses ridden by men who knew exactly where they were going, and more importantly, why they needed to get there quickly. My hands moved with desperate, frantic efficiency, stuffing the most vital documents inside my shirt, pressing them against my chest. The irrefutable evidence of my family's rightful claim to this vast territory was, I knew, more valuable than all the gold in the world, and infinitely dangerously more valuable. Because the people approaching, the men whose voices I could now almost distinguish, had far, far too much to lose if the truth about the Stone legacy ever reached the territorial courts. The voices outside the waterfall, though still muffled by the cascade, carried clearly through the swirling mist, sharp with self-assured authority and barely controlled anger. I pressed myself flat against the cold, damp cave wall, the precious documents crinkling against my chest as Blaze positioned himself at the cavern entrance, every muscle in his powerful body tensed, coiled for action. 3 distinct voices, perhaps even 4, belonging to men who spoke with the chilling confidence of people accustomed to being implicitly obeyed. Trails fresh. Dog and rider coming this way every day for the past week. The speaker's voice carried the clipped precision of someone highly trained in tracking a professional hunter. Prints show the same horse, same boots, same dog paws. They've been making regular trips here. Check behind the waterfall, commanded a second voice, older, harder, laced with an undeniable edge of menace. Marcus Stone was clever enough to hide his evidence somewhere the weather couldn't reach it. If that cache still exists, it's back there. My blood turned to ice at the mention of my grandfather's name. These weren't random riders who had merely stumbled across our trail. They knew exactly why I was here, knew precisely what I might have found, and terrifyingly understood the profound implications of that discovery far, far better than I did myself. "You sure the old man didn't take everything with him when he ran?" asked a third voice, younger but carrying the same sinister underlying threat. "Positive. We searched his house before the fire, checked his bank accounts, even questioned the few friends stupid enough to help him. Marcus Stone hid something he thought could hurt us, but he never had time to retrieve it. They've been waiting 40 years for someone in his family to come looking." Blaze's low guttural growl warned me that the searchers were now getting alarmingly close to the waterfall. My dog had positioned himself to defend the cave entrance, a valiant, unwavering protector. But against multiple armed men, courage alone would only delay the inevitable. I needed another option, and I needed it with a desperate, frantic urgency. The cave, I remembered, extended further back than the filtered light revealed, disappearing into an impenetrable darkness that might offer concealment, or just as likely might simply trap us against solid rock. There was no way to know without exploring, and absolutely no time for safe reconnaissance. The voices outside grew more distinct, more immediate, as their owners approached the pool's very edge. "Water's been disturbed recent. See how the sediment stirred up? Someone went swimming here today." The tracker's voice, now closer, carried excitement mixed with grim satisfaction. "Boot prints in the mud by that ledge. Fresh ones. They went behind the water just like we figured. All of them. 2 sets going in. None coming out yet. They're still back there." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror as the horrifying realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Escape back through the waterfall was no longer possible. The men outside would be watching for any movement, their weapons surely drawn, ready to intercept us the very moment we emerged from behind the cascade. The cave had become a trap, a deadly snare, just as it had probably been intended to be 40 years ago, when my grandfather first hid his damning evidence here. Blaze pressed against my leg, a silent comfort, a powerful act of solidarity. Whatever happened next, we would face it together, just as we had faced every challenge, every hardship during our 15 years of unwavering partnership. My dog's absolute loyalty had led us to this moment of truth, and now that same fierce loyalty might be all that stood between us and the men who had ruthlessly destroyed the Stone family once before. "Check your weapons," ordered the older voice, sharp and cold. "When they come out, we end this the same way we should have ended it 40 years ago. No stone gets a second chance to threaten what we've built." The chilling sound of metal sliding against leather carried clearly through the swirling mist as guns were drawn, and checked the clicks echoing with a terrifying finality. These men had come prepared for violence, ready to eliminate any threat to their stolen legacy. But they had made one crucial, fatal mistake. They assumed I would try to escape the same way I had entered. The cave's depth remained unknown, its secrets still unexplored. And sometimes, when all other options disappeared, the only choice was to venture deeper into the encroaching darkness, and desperately hope it led somewhere other than death. The cave curved sharply to the right, opening abruptly into a vast echoing chamber that had been carved by centuries of relentless underground water flow. I felt my way through the absolute suffocating darkness, one hand trailing along the damp, cold stone wall, while Blaze's warm, reassuring presence pressed steadfastly against my leg. The menacing sound of our pursuers, their voices, and the clatter of their weapons faded behind us, muffled by the immense rock and increasing distance. But the chilling knowledge that armed men waited patiently at the only known exit made every single step feel like walking deeper into an inevitable tomb. Then I felt it. A subtle, ethereal whisper of moving air against my face, carrying faint, earthy scents that didn't belong in an enclosed subterranean space. Pine needles, wild grass, the clean, crisp smell of the open sky. Another exit. Blaze, of course, had already detected it, his extraordinary nose working overtime as he strained, pulling me gently, insistently towards the undeniable source of fresh air. The passage narrowed again, forcing us to squeeze through tight gaps barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. But the current of outside air grew stronger, more invigorating with each arduous step. Marcus Stone had chosen his hiding place with meticulous foresight, selecting a cave system with multiple concealed entrances that could serve as vital escape routes if discovery, as he must have known it would, became inevitable. The crawl space opened abruptly into a blinding rush of daylight, so shockingly bright it made my eyes water profusely after the prolonged darkness. We emerged onto a rocky shelf, completely hidden behind a dense, impenetrable stand of towering pines, utterly invisible from the waterfall pool far below. This perfectly concealed entrance explained with stunning clarity how Blaze had initially discovered this place during his relentless pursuit of the wounded deer. My dog had probably been following the faint scent trails of the injured animal, which would have naturally led him up this alternate hidden route, finding the precious cache from the back entrance, rather than the more obvious, dramatic approach behind the waterfall. From our elevated, unseen position, I could see the men below with chilling clarity. 4 riders, heavily armed and strategically positioned to watch every single inch of the pool's perimeter. I immediately recognized 2 of them from official territorial meetings. Ostensibly respected citizens who had built their reputations their entire lives on land that rightfully, undeniably belonged to my family. The older man giving orders, his voice carrying clearly on the wind, was Samuel Blackwood, the current immensely powerful holder of the largest ranch in the entire territory. The tracker, his foreman, was a notorious man named Silas Crane, who had a well-deserved reputation for making problems, and people disappear quietly and efficiently. They were trapped in a waiting game, I realized with grim satisfaction, fully expecting their quarry me to emerge from behind the waterfall, with hands raised, resignation etched onto my face, ready to surrender. Instead, I had the undeniable advantage of high ground, and more importantly, advanced intimate knowledge of their sinister intentions. And most crucially, I still had the irrefutable proof of their 40-year-old crimes, the documents still pressed tightly against my chest. Evidence that could utterly destroy everything they had painstakingly built on stolen foundations. But getting that precious evidence to someone who could act on it, someone with the power and integrity to bring them to justice, meant surviving the next few harrowing hours. Blaze nudged my hand, gently drawing my attention to a sudden new movement in the valley far below. More riders, approaching rapidly from the direction of town, responding to some prearranged signal. The net was closing, I realized, with a fresh wave of dread transforming this desperate confrontation into something far larger, far more menacing than a simple recovery mission. These men, I now understood with horrifying certainty, intended to end the stone threat permanently, brutally, just as they had done 40 years ago with my grandfather. I counted the approaching riders, my mind racing, estimating their numbers, their weapons, and their probable deadly intentions. 8 men total, enough, more than enough, to meticulously search every cave and crevice within miles. Enough, more than enough, to ensure that no evidence of their systemic corruption ever reached civilized authority. They had far, far too much to lose to allow any living member of the Stone family to survive with knowledge of their massive theft. The documents pressed against my chest seemed to burn with the accumulated weight of generations of injustice. My grandfather had died in exile, a broken man, knowing that his son and grandson would inherit nothing but a fabricated history, a legacy of lies about their true birthright. The men below had built empires on a foundation of brazen fraud, raised families on wealth that rightfully belonged to others, and corrupted every institution, every person that might have provided justice. But they had made one crucial, fatal error. They had allowed their profound, decades-long guilt to fester into an all-consuming paranoia, responding to threats that hadn't even fully materialized by coming here in overwhelming force, by speaking openly, brazenly about their heinous crimes within hearing range of their intended victim. They had unwittingly provided the final, irrefutable piece of evidence needed to utterly destroy them. I eased back from the edge of the rocky shelf and began working my way stealthily along the ridge, staying low, moving with meticulous care through the dense concealing cover that would hide my movements from the watchful eyes below. Blaze followed silently, his every movement, a testament to his understanding that stealth now meant survival for both of us. The territorial capital lay 2 days' hard ride south, a bastion of federal judges and marshals who I knew had no connection to the pervasive local corruption that had poisoned my family's legacy. Men who would find the documents now clutched against my chest very, very interesting, especially when combined with my eyewitness testimony about overheard confessions and a witnessed conspiracy. But first I had to survive long enough to make that ride. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. And this time the hunted had advantages the hunters didn't expect. The invaluable knowledge of the truth, the irrefutable proof of their crimes, and a loyal, unwavering companion who had already proven that sometimes the most life-changing discoveries come from simply following instincts that lead to hidden places where justice has been patiently waiting for decades just for someone brave enough to claim it. I reached Daisy, who stood patiently tethered among the pines, just as shouts erupted from the waterfall below. Someone had discovered the cave's back entrance, probably by following Blaze's scent trail through the dense pine grove. The precious advantage of surprise was dissolving rapidly as the searchers spread out their voices, echoing to cover both potential escape routes. Time had suddenly become my most formidable enemy, measured now in minutes rather than hours. I swung into the saddle, my movements quick and fluid, just as Blaze leaped up behind me, a maneuver we had practiced countless times during frantic cattle drives when my dog, exhausted, needed to ride rather than run. Daisy responded to my urgency, launching into a powerful gallop that carried us away from the ridge before our pursuers could organize an effective pursuit. But 8 mounted men with intimate local knowledge of this territory wouldn't be far behind. The main trail towards town offered the most direct route to federal authorities, but it was also the most predictable path for men who knew this territory as well as I did. I chose instead to follow the winding game trails that snake through the dense, unforgiving forest. paths that would slow their pursuit while offering crucial concealment from distant observation. My mare knew these routes from years of tracking strays, and her sure footing gave us a crucial advantage over riders following unfamiliar ground. Blaze's ears swiveled constantly, independently monitoring faint sounds that human senses couldn't possibly detect. My dog's extraordinary alertness had saved us once already today, and I trusted those honed instincts more than my own limited ability to detect approaching danger. When Blaze's posture shifted to subtly indicate riders closing from the east, I immediately altered course towards rougher, more challenging terrain, where horses would struggle and men would be forced to dismount to maintain pursuit. The documents pressed against my chest felt heavier with each mile, as if the immense weight of 40 years of injustice had concentrated itself into those folded papers. My grandfather's careful handwriting, the lawyer's detailed accusations, the survey maps showing stolen boundaries. All of it represented far more than just family history. It was proof that could topple the territorial government itself and redistribute wealth across 3 entire valleys. But only if it reached honest authorities before Samuel Blackwood and his Confederates could silence the only living witness to their overheard confessions. The sun climbed towards its zenith, a relentless eye in the sky, as we pushed deeper into a wilderness that offered both crucial concealment and profound isolation from any help. Daisy maintained her punishing pace admirably, but I could feel her beginning to labor, her powerful muscles straining beneath the double burden of man and dog across increasingly difficult terrain. Blaze seemed to sense her fatigue, shifting his weight instinctively, subtly, to minimize the strain on the magnificent animal that carried our desperate hopes for survival. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew more organized, more menacing. Multiple groups of riders were working together now, probably using pre-arranged signals to coordinate their search pattern and prevent me from doubling back towards inhabited areas. Professional hunting tactics that suggested these men had eliminated threats before, probably during the original brutal campaign against my grandfather's family. The grim realization that I was now following quite literally in Marcus Stone's footsteps, fleeing the same ruthless enemies through the same unforgiving wilderness, filled me with a cold, unyielding determination. My grandfather had died in exile, his spirit broken, never seeing justice for the monstrous crimes committed against his family. But circumstances were different now. The territorial capital had federal judges with no local connections, federal marshals whose authority superseded any corrupt territorial officials. Men who would find documented evidence of systematic fraud very interesting indeed, especially when supported by eyewitness testimony. Blaze's low, urgent growl warned of immediate impending danger. Riders approached rapidly from ahead, blocking the most direct route towards civilization. Blackwood, the old fox, had anticipated our destination, had positioned his men to intercept us before we could reach federal authority. The net was closing systematically, relentlessly driven by 40 years of simmering paranoia about this exact scenario. But paranoia, I realized with a sudden electrifying clarity, also created crucial weaknesses. Men who had spent decades worrying about exposure had, in their very efforts to prevent it, inadvertently revealed their own guilt. By organizing this massive overt manhunt, by speaking openly, brazenly about their crimes, by demonstrating their willingness to kill rather than face justice, Blackwood and his Confederates had provided a final devastating piece of evidence that would utterly destroy them even if the original documents were somehow lost. I urged Daisy towards a deep, winding creek bed that offered both immediate concealment and harder, rockier ground that would minimize our tracks. The game wasn't over yet, and sometimes when pushed to the absolute brink, the hunted could, if they chose their ground carefully, and fought with the desperate, unyielding ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose, become the hunter. Blaze's warm, powerful presence at my back reminded me that I wasn't facing this impossible challenge alone. My dog's unwavering loyalty had started this entire life-altering journey, leading us to discoveries that would change everything. Now that same fierce loyalty would help us finish what Marcus Stone had been brutally forced to leave incomplete 40 years ago. The federal marshal's office in the territorial capital buzzed with a controlled, intense activity as I carefully spread my grandfather's meticulously preserved documents across the wide, polished mahogany desk. Marshal Harrison Webb, a man whose very name I noted with a surge of hope, was a direct link to the lawyer who had originally tried to help the Stone family, studied the evidence with growing incredulous amazement. The detailed survey maps, the ancient property deeds, the heartfelt correspondence. All of it painted a horrifyingly clear picture of systemic fraud that reached into every single level of the territorial government. Blaze lay patiently beneath the desk, utterly exhausted from our harrowing, desperate escape through a wilderness that had tested every survival skill I possessed. We had reached town just before dawn, slipping past Blackwood's sprawling search parties by meticulously following winding creek beds and barely discernible game trails that offered crucial concealment from their relentless mounting pursuit. My dog's unfailing, unerring instincts had guided us through our darkest hours, just as his initial, inexplicable curiosity about the faint scents behind the waterfall had initiated this entire life-changing discovery. These signatures match our territorial records perfectly, Webb said, his voice tight with controlled righteous anger. Samuel Blackwood, Silas Crane, Judge Albert Finch, all of them meticulously documented here as conspirators in what amounts to the largest, most audacious land theft in territorial history. Your grandfather wasn't just wealthy, Mr. Stone. He was one of the true founding families of this territory. The marshal's deputies, grim-faced and determined, had already ridden out with federal warrants, armed with an authority that utterly superseded any local influence Blackwood or his cohorts might still wield. The insidious net that had been closing so menacingly around me just 12 hours earlier was now tightening irrevocably around the very men who had stolen my family's legacy. Justice so cruelly delayed by 40 long years was finally irrevocably within reach. The mineral rights alone are worth more than everything Blackwood claims to own. Webb continued, his eyes still scanning a particular contract that bore official territorial seals. Iron ore, copper deposits, water sources that control irrigation for half the territory. Your family didn't just lose a ranch, Mr. Stone. You lost an empire. I felt the immense weight of generations settling heavily on my shoulders as I finally grasped the full devastating scope of my true inheritance. The modest life I had painstakingly built with Blaze's steadfast companionship had been nothing more than a pale shadow of what should have been my birthright. But that very modest life had also, I realized, taught me invaluable lessons, instilled in me values that wealth alone could never provide. Loyalty, hard work, the profound quiet satisfaction of building something tangible with my own hands rather than inheriting a false luxury built on corruption and lies. A sudden commotion outside announced the return of the federal deputies leading a grim-faced group of prisoners whose faces I recognized undeniably from the terrifying confrontation at the waterfall. Samuel Blackwood rode with his hands bound tightly, his expression shifting rapidly between furious, impotent rage and stark, paralyzing fear as the horrifying realization hit him. 40 years of careful, calculated deception had crumbled, irrevocably in a single day. The other conspirators followed behind him, their stolen confidence utterly replaced by the hollow, defeated look of men who knew with bone-deep certainty that their crimes had finally at long last caught up with them. They didn't resist arrest, reported Deputy Foster, dismounting with visible satisfaction, his face etched with grim triumph. As soon as we mentioned the Stone documents, they knew the game was over. Found even more damning evidence hidden in Blackwood's house, including extensive correspondence that proves the land theft was planned meticulously years before they even executed it. Webb nodded grimly, his jaw tight as he signed additional warrants. They'll stand trial in federal court, far away from any local influence they might still command. The territorial government will need a complete restructuring once this widespread corruption comes to light. I walked to the window, my gaze sweeping over the town that would soon learn how its most prominent, respected citizens had built their vast fortunes on a foundation of lies and fraud. The adjustment, I knew, would be difficult, profoundly unsettling for everyone involved. But justice, true justice, required truth regardless of how uncomfortable, how inconvenient that truth might be. My grandfather had died believing his family's name would never be cleared, his legacy forever buried. Now Marcus Stone's legacy would be triumphantly restored, and his killers, the men who had stolen everything, would finally face the bitter consequences they had so skillfully avoided for 4 long decades. Blaze appeared silently beside me, pressing against my leg, with the same warm, unwavering loyalty that had guided us through this entire harrowing ordeal. My dog had somehow known with an almost supernatural intuition that following those faint, compelling scents behind the waterfall would lead to discoveries that would irrevocably change everything. Perhaps it had been mere coincidence, or perhaps, just perhaps, some animals understood justice in profound ways that utterly transcended human comprehension. 3 months later, I stood on the wide, expansive porch of the grand stately house that had once belonged to Samuel Blackwood, now legally restored to its rightful owner, me through federal court decree. Blaze lay stretched out in the shade nearby, a picture of contented peace, watching cattle graze across vast verdant valleys that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The modest ranch I had known, the life I had built, had indeed become the headquarters of an empire that spanned 3 territories. But the fundamental values that had guided our simple, honest life, Blaze's and mine, remained gloriously unchanged. The stone name was respected again, mentioned prominently in territorial newspapers, as a shining example of justice delayed but emphatically not denied. The men who had so ruthlessly stolen my grandfather's legacy were now beginning lengthy, well-deserved prison sentences in harsh federal facilities far from the territory they had so thoroughly corrupted. And Blaze, my faithful companion, whose boundless curiosity had initiated this entire transformative journey, finally enjoyed the comfort, the security, and the profound peaceful happiness he had always deserved. Sometimes the most life-changing discoveries, I reflected, come not from grand plans or elaborate schemes, but from simply following loyal, unwavering instincts towards hidden places, where truth, like a patient sleeping dragon, has been waiting for generations just for someone brave enough to claim it.